Smash!
Space Marines.
Hey, today I've got something rather special for you guys. As you may or may not know, I had planned on reviving the marine painting series on the channel with a new spin. Not only will I be painting niche chapters, but I'd also add something unique to them by either crafting or kitbashing. And originally this was just going to be a Brazen Claws episode, but I ultimately decided I wanted to add in my personal favorite of the Iron Hand Successors in the form of the Sons of Medusa. And since I felt that 2 chapters was weird, I decided to put out a little poll and you guys voted for the Knights of Byzantium. I'm not saying it again. I've recorded this 5 times. I should also note that for this video, the painting portions are quite speedy. Not speed painted, mind you. For time's sake, I decided to make them a little bit quicker, akin more so to the older Citadel tutorials. I also made sure to put in proper timestamps for each chapter. If you want to just watch the kitbashing, be my guest. If you want to just watch the painting, be my guest. Do whatever. But before we get into the hobbying, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you like what you see. Hit the bell for notifications to never miss another video. And if you really enjoy it, consider becoming a channel member. You get to see my videos early, you get to have access to exclusive videos, and it helps fund more cool content for the channel overall. I'll actually have a much more in-depth painting tutorial on each of these schemes for channel members, as well as additional chapters that I don't exactly want to kitbash, but I do want to paint. Just want to say a huge thank you to my channel members. You guys are amazing. But enough yapping, it's time to get bashing. That didn't exactly rhyme, but whatever. So the first chapter we'll take a look at is the Brazen Claws. These guys are awesome. They're basically just more insane Iron Hands. I myself am not a particularly big fan of Iron Hands, but I really do love their successors. And it's kind of interesting that there's really only a handful that are actually confirmed successors, but each of them seem to be fan favorites. But to start things out, I'll be using the body of a tech marine. I know it seems like a bit much considering this is a proper specialist, but I actually plan on cannibalizing the rest of this guy for another kitbash that you guys will see later on, so using it as a base body for a lieutenant seemed appropriate. To add on to the body, I decided to use this robotic arm and chainsword from the Sternguard Veterans kit. I kinda hate to admit this, but this arm actually belongs to one of the veterans that I kitbashed in the Space Marine kitbashing video months back. But don't fret, I plan on using that guy for something else really cool down the line. For his other arm, I'm actually going back to the Sternguard kit, and I'm going to be using this bolt pistol, and it has this cool tech bracer attached to it. It already looks quite good for the figure, but I'll be adding on to this later on. For his pauldrons, I used a basic Mark 7 pauldron and a Brazen Claw pauldron from the Deathwatch kit. That kit in particular has some pretty amazing bits for kitbashing Space Marines. I'll most definitely get a lot of mileage out of it. For his melon, I wasn't quite sure what to use, but I ultimately just decided to use the Tech Marine one. So far, he basically just looks like a less powerful Tech Marine, but we'll be adding on more interesting elements to really make him stand out and be his own unique design. Next, I would glue on this little dial thingy from the Iron Hands upgrade kit, which kinda seems like a no-brainer, but I really only use this kit sparingly amongst these 3 figures. The bits are nice, but again, I really don't like Iron Hands, so having a ton of their pauldrons isn't exactly ideal. Moving back to his bracer, I decided to glue on these wires which came from a Primaris Aggressors kit. This would attach to the bottom of the pauldron and attach very lightly to the bracer itself. It doesn't fully conform, but we'll fix this later on. I then take the time to go around the mini with my mold line shaver, just to give him a little cleaning. And then I'd take a larger wire from the Aggressors kit and I'd attach it to the back of the Marine. It will attach to the arm, and this will be kind of obscured by the backpack. It doesn't fully fit to anything in particular, but it'll be obscured like I said, so it'll look just fine. Just make sure to glue it down nicely. Speaking of the power pack, I'm not using anything special, this is just a basic Primaris one. However, I will be gluing on this little tracker node thing from the Deathwatch backpack. It looks a little weird being centered in the middle, but there's really nothing else that I could put it on, and I think it looks fine as is. Once I was done with that, I decided to shave off the Mechanicum symbol on the chest. I had an idea for using it for another kitbash, but part of me kinda regrets it. But at the same time, I also want to make this guy look more so like a specialized lieutenant rather than a full-blown tech marine, so removing it seems like the appropriate option overall. I don't know, I kinda go back and forth on it. I would do my best to really sand down the chest plate after I did so. I really don't want to leave some awkward, uneven texture. Next, I'd attach this cable bit from the Gene Cult Acolytes kit. This comes from the rock grinder and it works perfectly here. I'd place it under the backpack and I'd fit it in tandem with the other cable on the bracer. And at this point I decided to fill in some of these gaps using sprue goo, and I want to be very sparing with this. I really do not want to obscure any details on the tubes. After applying it, I just want to take one last look at this fella, inspect any imperfections, inspect all the little bits, make sure everything's glued down, and at that point I was quite happy with him. So it's time we get into the painting. After a Zenithal Prime, I'd begin by applying a mixture of ball red mixed 1-to-1 with Flesh Tears red over all the red portions. You might think that you need to be super careful during this process, but I assure you, if you spill onto the blue side, it's just fine. Just make sure to really get a good coating of the red. We'll be applying another red color over this anyway, so just worry about establishing a good base. After doing so, we'll paint on the blue by using Proacryl's blue. This color is very strong, especially over a Zenithal Prime, and again, do not stress about being super neat. This scheme takes time, and we'll be cleaning up the lines momentarily. Just focus once more on getting a good opaque finish on the quartered sections before worrying about the lines separating the two colors. Coming back to the red, I began applying burnt red from Proacryl over this established color. This is really just to strengthen the overall finish, as this color is much stronger in terms of opacity, so I'll be using this to clean up the lines between the red and the blue. Don't be afraid to come back in and drive-bys and keep cleaning it up. Next, for all the mechanical bits, I'm applying Vallejo Model Color Black to every last portion. There is a lot on this miniature, so really take your time to apply it. Be sure to get a really strong finish on all of these parts. For some parts, I used a little bit of Black Legion, mostly to get a strong color fast, but I'd suggest just using the model color instead. After doing so, I'd go back in on the model and I'd clean up any of the areas that the black may have spilled onto the red or the blue. I'd also be cognizant of any bald spots, just making sure that each side is completely clean. I'd also take the time to paint in the Brazen Claw symbol, exclusively using burnt red. Now he's really looking good. We've got some strong colors all over, and he's ready to be shaded. I'd then go over the entirety of the model using a mix of Vallejo Game Color Sepia ink 1-to-1 with black ink. I'll be sure to watch every little nook and cranny on the mini. Granted, there are some portions of this mini that I would wash with the same color later on, but I just want to focus on the main armor. Once I fully coated the model and let it dry, I would paint on some of the cables using dark ivory. I'll be applying some contrast over these in a little bit. Our first priority now is to clean up the model, and I would lightly reapply the blue as well as the dark red over the broader sections. And I'd be sure to water the paint down a little bit more than usual. Not a ton, but enough to make the color more faint. After doing so, I'd apply some Imperial Fist onto the wires, and like I mentioned earlier, I'd just be shading these using the same ink mixture from earlier, but again, this is a more personalized element to the mini, so whatever. Primary color is always pop. After doing so, I would give the entire model a proper heavy dry brushing of dark silver from Proacryl. This will leave him with a really beat down mechanical industrial finish. Recently, this technique has kind of become a favorite of mine. It really works in terms of painting grimdark style, or I guess in my case, kind of a grimdark light style. It really does make the miniature look realistic. After doing so, I would also use a smaller dry brush and I would apply some Game Color Silver Metallic over the tubes, weapon, and especially over the servo arm. After that was done, we'd come back in with the additional cleanup, this time being much more sparing than the last. We're basically just glazing on the red and the blue to very lightly revitalize the main color. Next, I'd fill in the eyes using a very watery mix of dark ivory. I really want to pool this into the recesses and very lightly fill in the center. Next, I'd use a little bit of Black Legion over the tubes. I'd avoid the little connecting sections, however. With that metallic undercoat, it really looks cool. I'd also apply this a little bit to the tubes on the helmet, and after doing so, I'd apply just a little bit of light green to the weird tube on the strange dial-y thing on his belt. For all the gold elements on the miniature, I mixed some Procryl copper and rich gold onto the skull, as well as some of the little elements of the chainsword. I'd also wash these colors using the same mixture from earlier. I suppose I probably should have painted a Marine with an Aquila, but I don't know, man, this looks cool as is. I don't think I'd change anything. Coming back to his eyes, I'd mix Karendros green and Imperial Fist 2-to-1 to make a really intense green. This truly brings the model together in my opinion. The vibrance of the eyes works so well with the beaten down scheme that we've painted so far. As one final little method for weathering down the mini, I used some Beastly Brown and I watered it down to a wash. We'll be painting this into some of the recesses of the armor. Don't use too much of it, as with most weathering, less is more. But this combined with the dark silver dry brush, it just looks incredible. And as one final little thing, I'd apply a little bit of Black Legion to the gun case as well as the chainsword. And after that, I was left with a truly amazing looking Marine. This is one of my favorite Space Marines I've ever painted in general. I really don't like throwing that term around. This chapter was actually kind of low on my list in terms of my personal excitement to paint them, but much like the Raptors chapter, I found that improvising and coming up with a personal mix on the spot was incredibly gratifying. Personally, I don't think I'd ever want to paint these guys in a proper army, but a kill team? Now we're kind of talking. Next up, I'm going to be working on an old personal favorite of mine, the Sons of Medusa. These guys are niche, but man do they have a dedicated cult following. The people that like these guys really seem to like them, and I can see why. They have a good amount of lore, a cool and relatively simple color scheme, so what's there not to like? To start our guy out, I utilized another part of the Tech Marine, this time being the secondary arm option, kind of this little grabby hand. The body I used is an old push-fit Marine from back in the day that I ironically actually painted as the Sons of Medusa. Unfortunately, I stripped this mini well before the channel even started, so I don't exactly have pictures. But I assure you, you're not really missing much. For his melon, I opted to use this tactical helm from the Corvus Marine set, kind of a comms officer of sorts. I would have used a basic helmet to show off the color scheme better, but I decided that using the Aquila to show off the white portion would be a better idea anyway, and I really do think that this head works better for the miniature overall. My first priority was just kind of making cool figures. With the pose of the figure combined with the arm, I kind of fiddled with the positioning of the head, and already I'm really digging this figure. No matter what direction he looks, it looks cool. For the next bit, I'd clip off this targeting module from the Firstborn Devastator kit. I would sand it down, and though I admittedly didn't get it as flat as it could have been on the underside, it still conformed well to the top of the Primaris backpack with some Tamiya. Once it was in place, I decided to use this bolt rifle from the Iron Hands upgrade kit. Again, I want to be sparing in terms of my usage of the upgrade kit itself, but I dug the Robo Hand and the drum mag, and the pose is really striking in my opinion, so I felt this bit was necessary. After I was happy with the placement, I decided to snip off these little side nodules on the left side of the power pack. I'd then dry fit and eyeball measure a little spare tube bit, this being from the Librarian kit. And then I'd slice it down and use some Tamiya to bridge the tubes of the tech arm to the backpack. After doing so, I'd glue the rest of the tube that I used to the underside, as there was a lot of extra space on the areas that I'd clipped off. And after fiddling around with it, I used this little incense ornament from the Skitarii kit, and I'd glue it onto the other tube. Technically, the little incense thing is attached to a tube to begin with, but I already attached this one, and I felt that the Skitarii-sized tubes were a little shrimpy. This figure is really coming together by this point, but the last bit I'd add here would really cement him as a proper Son of Medusa. This being another Deathwatch pauldron, and I think technically this is listed as the Nova Marine symbol on the box, but they practically have identical icons, so this works perfectly for a Sons of Medusa. The other pauldron, I wasn't really sure what to use, but I eventually decided on using a Corvus pauldron from the Firstborn kit. I wasn't sure about it, but once I got to the painting process, I was pretty happy with my decision. And speaking of painting, it's time we get into it. After a Zenithal Prime, I'd airbrush the mini using light green from Vallejo Model Color. This left me with an incredibly strong start to the armor. I really strongly suggest using an airbrush for light green. It's kind of a thin color on its own. But after doing so, we'll do the same thing that we did with the Brazen Claw by applying black over all the metallic elements of the model. Again, be sure to really leave a strong opaque finish. Next, I'd apply Ghost Gray over the Aquila, and like I said earlier, just use the same method I'm using for the Aquila on any helmets. I'd also pool just a little bit of this color into the middle of the symbol, and I'd slightly wipe away the excess using a Q-tip. You don't need to wipe away the excess really, I just suggest letting it dry first and then reapplying the black. But next, I'm using the same shade as we used on the Brazen Claw, this being a 1-to-1 mix of black ink with sepia ink. Make sure to really work this into every portion of the mini. And once again, after the shade dries, we'll be dry brushing over the entirety of the mini using dark silver from Pro Acryl. So before you say anything or click off the video, yes, I am doing a very similar method for the Sons of Medusa as I did the Brazen Claws. This time, however, to re-establish the color, I decided to use a sponge using light green. After sponging it on and really making sure to revitalize the main areas by getting rid of some of the more broader sections of the scratches, I begin highlighting the edges of the mini using a mixture of light green mixed with just a little bit of mood green. I'd also utilize this color to make really strong scratches over the model. If you're familiar at all with how I paint Space Marines typically, you already know what I'm planning on doing with these scratches. If you don't, stay tuned, I think you'll really like it. Coming back to the Aquila, I'd revitalize it using a little bit more Ghost Gray, and I'd apply this over the little wings. Had I painted the helmet, I suggest using a highlight of bold titanium white on the sharpest edges. Next, I'd begin using watered-down black ink, and I'd paint this directly into the recesses as well as some of the metallic bits. I just want to tone things down slightly. Coming back to the Sons of Medusa symbol, I'd paint the black portions using some Black Legion. And I'd also utilize this color in some of the tubes on the model, much like I did with the Brazen Claw. I'd also use Flesh Terror's red on some of the cables to better contrast with the green. Coming back to the main power armor, to fill in all those scratches, I'm using some Dryad bark. This is one of my favorite techniques for painting Marines in general, and you just want to focus this into the middle of all these little scratches. It really makes the armor pop and it's incredibly eye-catching. After doing so, we'd come back in using a little bit of Pro Acryl bronze on the incense tube and some of the bits on the targeting node. After primarily working it into the crosshair lens, I really like how these colors contrast. This being the green and the bronze. I also ended up painting the studs on the Corvus pauldron with this color as well. After doing so, I do a slight dry brushing of silver from Vallejo, just to add in some more sporadic scratches. You really don't have to do this, I just thought it would look kinda cool. But to finish things off, I'm using the Beastly Brown once more to add in those little rusty weathering patches along the armor. And especially on this green color, it looks really good. Like I said previously, be sparing with this. Try to spread it out, and drag the color down on any broad sections of the armor. It really looks realistic that way. And as one technical final little bit, I decided to add in just a little bit of the main wash back onto the Aquila, just to add a tiny bit more definition. And once I based this fella, I was left with a wonderfully grimdark interpretation of the mean green, mostly machine marines we all love. The scheme in particular was something I kinda struggled with, as I felt the color overall was a little bit more on the cooler side of green as opposed to the canonically warm shade. But I've kinda noticed every time I see painted Sons of Medusa, the greens range from basically straight moot green to heavy metal salamanders green. So I'm pretty chuffed with this scheme overall. I almost said it again, but I'll be honest with you, I kinda want to make a kill team out of this scheme. Especially with Space Marines, I am so indecisive. But moving on, we'll be tackling our final scheme of the video, and we'll be painting the Knights of Byzantium. These guys are quite new, as they're an Ultima founded chapter, and the only art we have of these guys are actually painted models by Harvey Snape. Technically, this chapter is a homebrew/canonical chapter, and the only information that we really have on them is they love ranged combat. What cowards. Anyway, to start out the figure, I'd be giving our Marine a Deathwatch bolt gun as the mechanical and over-teched bits are befitting. Also, the reason that this Aquila is shaved off the model is this is kind of an older one that I didn't know what to do with. But thankfully the extra real estate allows me to play around more so with the main color, so it's kind of a weird pseudo-happy accident. Next for his melon, I used an Iron Hands helmet from the upgrade kit. I like this helmet as it was only slightly augmented, and the miniatures provided by the White Dwarf catalog doesn't feature a single Marine with any forms of upgraded bits or sort of augments, so I felt like going a little bit light on the tech bits would be more befitting to this chapter. Still, I want to give this guy a little bit more flair and flavor, so I decided to use this pointing servo arm from the same upgrade sprue. I'd point it upward, which kind of makes him look like a WWE ref counting someone out, but we'll be snipping off this hand instead. I really want to keep this cut clean, as the hand itself could be useful for future kit bashes. To replace it, I'm using a power sword from the Mark IV Space Marines kit. I've had this sword in storage for ages, so it's really nice to give it a purpose. For the pauldrons, I used 2 Corvus pattern ones without the studs. I felt that the chapter's color scheme kind of gives them this decadent aura, so having these 2 trimless pauldrons seemed like kind of a cool idea to really showcase the white. Also, I know a lot of them are painted with black, but I felt like going with the white would be more fun. As one final bit, I decided to add on some thin cork to the base, mostly just so I could fit on the servo skull from the Grey Knight's Paladin kit. I kind of find this to be on the edge of kit bashing and not kit bashing, as it really just is adding another figure on. But I think servo skulls are awesome, and they always make figures look better in my opinion. But now that he's built, it's time to get to the painting. To start the figure out, I would airbrush over Baraknar Burgundy from Citadel over as a base coat. I then begin washing the entirety of the mini using a 1-to-1 mix of Baraknar and black. It doesn't really matter which black you use, but for this I'm using Vallejo model color. While the wash works its magic and dries, we can take our time base coating the metallics on the model using black once more. This time, however, we aren't going to be doing the same heavily weathered style in this Marine. I want to give it a little bit more of a clean look. Also, to base coat the bronzy details, I'm using some warm brown from Proacryl. Same with any other warmer metallic colors. After doing so, I would base coat the pauldrons using a mix of bold titanium white 5-to-1 with black. The slight touch of black really dulls down the white to an almost Celestra gray hue. You could just use Celestra gray, but being that these are Proacryl colors, they have a much better consistency and you can work with them easier. I'm being careful not to spill this color onto the burgundy, mind you. I would suggest painting this color first before applying the Baraknar black wash that we applied earlier. Just something for you to keep in mind. Next, to start the bronzy elements, I'm using Proacryl's copper. I know it's kind of weird to paint the bronze sections using copper, but I feel like this is a really good starting point. Plus, it's just fun to work with Proacryl's metallics. After doing so, I'd paint in all the metallic bits using dark silver, this being portions of the backpack, the weapons, with the only exception being the servo arm. For this, I'm painting using some Vallejo Game Color metallic silver. Back to the main portion of the armor, we'll be applying a chunky highlight of Baraknar 1-to-1 with Screamer Pink. Just make sure to go along the edges, but don't worry too much about being super neat. We just kind of want to sketch out the highlights. Next, we'll highlight using the same mix 2-to-1 with Dark Ivory. This will be a much sharper highlight, and initially I began going in super clean, but I couldn't help but go back to my sketchy scraped highlights. I don't want to make them super weathered, but again, I have a weird distaste for hyper clean miniatures, especially Marines. It just doesn't seem realistic to me. And admittedly, these are also quite chunky, but that leaves us room to do one final highlight. This time we're upping the ratio of our mix 1-to-2 Baraknar Pink with Dark Ivory. This leaves the armor looking absolutely striking. But there is more work to do later on. Just make sure to regulate this highlight to the very tips of the armor, on the sharpest edges. Next, we'll be shading the metallics using black and sepia ink, this time a 3-to-1 mix. After doing so, I'd actually use the same wash into the recesses of the main armor. just to give a tiny bit more depth. I'd also use the same with the pauldrons, mostly into the recesses. Coming back to the helmet, I'd paint the augment bits using some metallic silver, and I'd begin highlighting the bronze using a mixture of copper mixed 1-to-1 with light bronze. This will be applied over the broad sections. Looking back, this is much more of a layering rather than a highlighting. This will give us that really nice warm bronze. Next, to highlight the white, I'm strictly dry brushing the pauldrons using bold titanium white, and I'd also add in some more direct highlights using a detail brush. The Tester's dry brush is kind of perfect for this. It really leaves on these nice streaky highlights. I'd also use bold titanium white to paint in the eyes. This time I'm kind of going for a classic line through the main eye, and I'm just painting in the servo eye directly. After they dried, I'd paint the eyes using achromatic blue. After doing so, we'll finish off the bronze by applying light bronze onto the sharpest edges. If you want, you could use a silver metallic, but I think this works as is. Like I alluded to prior, for one last detail on the armor, I decided to glaze over the entirety of it using heavily watered down ball red. I was happy with the color that we had, but it was definitely too purple as opposed to the much more reddish wine tone, and I want this to be as accurate as possible. Looking back, either way I think it looks really good, but I really feel that the ball red made everything pop. At the end of the day, I'm quite happy with this guy. And to be honest, I'm quite happy with all three of these fellas overall. And hey, if you stuck to the end, I greatly appreciate it. This video is a lot of work, but I definitely think it was worth it. Again, if you enjoyed what you saw or found it helpful, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more, and maybe share it with a friend who really likes these chapters, whether they paint or just like the lore. But I think I've flapped my beak enough for one video. So I'll leave you with a mishmash kit bash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.